Hey everyone, welcome to the May 6th First Tuesdays with Heart. First Tuesdays is sponsored by the Heart Peer Support Team in connection with the Resiliency and Justice Center. Heart stands for Healing, Empowering, and Rebuilding Together. We're a peer support program for anyone impacted by any mass violence incident. Real quick, if some of you guys haven't met us, we wanted to introduce the Heart Team real quick. Alice is the co-founder and co-director of the Heart Peer Support Program, and she's also the Route 91 and UNLV support group facilitator. Jackie is the Behavioral Health Program Coordinator with the Resiliency and Justice Center. She's one of our original Heart coaches, and she facilitates a Route 91 support group along with Third Tuesdays, with Heart. And I'm a Route 91 survivor. I assist Alice with the UNLV support group and Jackie with Third Tuesdays with Heart. So you guys may know May is Mental Health Awareness Month. So we wanted to start with this reminder. Mental health is important, and that's part of the reason we do this program every month. It's something that everyone has. It can be affected by life choices, eating, sleeping, exercise, and so many other things. It is absolutely worth making time for. It's part of being human. It can be both positive and negative. It's complex, as I think we all know, and it's very real. What it isn't is a sign of weakness. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's absolutely not all in our minds. It's not something to only take care of when things are hard. It's not a synonym for mental illness. It's not something that we can snap out of or just get over, and it is not fake. So tonight's presenter, we are super excited to have join us. Anne Seymour has 41 years of experience as a national advocate for crime and victim survivors. She's currently the Associate Academic Program Director for the National Mass Violence Center. She began her career in 1984 as a Director of Public Affairs for the National Office of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and from 1985 to 1993 as co-founder and Director of Communications and Resource Development of the National Victim Center, which is now the National Centers for Victims of Crime. For over 4 decades, she's written extensively about issues relevant to the news media's coverage of crime and victimization, which is why we figured she'd be perfect to join us. So she's been instrumental in developing the Office of Victims of Crime award-winning news media coverage of crime and victimization videotape in 1999. Following the terrorist acts of September 11th, she was a principal author of a guide of how to deal with the news media for victims and survivors of this tragedy. Seymour's lectured on these issues to most major professional journalism associations, including American Press Institute, International Association of Newspaper Ombudsmen, and the Associated Press Managing Editors Association. In addition, she's personally advocated for crime survivors in several high-profile criminal cases. So, Anne, thank you so much for joining us. I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jill, and thank you, Team Heart, and thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. Happy Tuesday. We were all just saying we can't believe it is already May. I am really grateful to be here because I have spent over 4 decades focusing a lot of my career as a national advocate for victims and survivors, specifically on the news media coverage of crime and victimization. And I want to give you a brief background that explains my obsession with this topic. In 1985, we were starting it was the Sonny Von Bulow National Victim Advocacy Center, which today is the National Center for Victims of Crime. And I met an advocate from Washington State. Her name was Linda Barker. She worked for family and friends of missing persons and homicide victims. And she was the advocate for many, many families whose loved ones were murdered by a spree killer who became known as the Green River Killer. And as most of you know, this person was not caught for decades. And so she was dealing with a lot of grief, but also the really awful way the news media covered their loved ones, the women in this case. And then shortly after meeting Linda, we met with family members of survivors of another spree perpetrator in the Northwest. the media described him as a law school student, rape crisis center volunteer, intelligent, handsome, and things like that. They were, of course, describing Ted Bundy. And then Linda sent me an article where one of his victims it was described as, and I can remember it like it was yesterday. It said her nude frozen body was found in a snowdrift. That was all they said about the survivor. And so in the months and kind of years, but very early on in my career, I met with folks from Parents of Murdered Children. I met with a lot of sexual assault survivors who were blamed and shamed by the news media for what had happened to them. And Linda and I together decided, this is a topic that needs a little bit of attention. And this was when the victims field was still pretty early. And I want to say we were just really ballsy, and I probably shouldn't use that word, but we just said we've got to get out and address this. And so a lot of what I'm presenting to you tonight has just been updated from the original work that I'm so proud of that we did in 1985, 1986, and 1987. And over the years, I've written primarily for victims and survivors, but we also wrote handbooks for victim service providers to advocate on behalf of victims in the media. And then with the journalism professor at MSU, Michigan State, Bonnie Buckaroo, we wrote a guidebook for journalists who cover crime and victimization. And so my attention to the topic is really, really broad, but still very focused. And everything I talk about tonight, my final slide is going to lead you to 7 tip sheets that we have written at the National Mass Violence, specifically addressing the news media coverage of mass violence incidents. And I'm glad Jill said in her introduction, it's not just when the crime occurs, it's never ending. And when you think about it, and I'll talk a little bit about going through a trial, but looking at annual observances, looking at when you build a memorial, as you are in Las Vegas, there's just a lot of media attention. And then every time a mass violence incident occurs, it just sort of brings up to the media in the community where your mass violence incident occurred before, that here's another MVI, and let's go talk to the folks who are from our community who can address the impact. While well-intended, I just want to say right up front, it can be a real trauma cue for survivors to have to continually speak to the news media. So I'm going to go to the next slide and talk about what I want to accomplish tonight, and hopefully you guys will agree. I want to start up front by identifying what I call considerations and consequences when victims choose to deal with the news media. There's positive and there's negative. And then I want to describe what we wrote in 1985, 86 and have updated since then, and for this purposes of this, specifically for mass violence victims, guidelines for victims in the news media. And then I think at that point, Jill, I am going to want to stop and see if people have questions. I really want to listen to you, learn from you, and hear from your learned experiences, both positive and negative, about dealing with the news media. I want to talk a little bit about responsible reporting and informed consent, and that's from the aspect of journalists. Early on at the National Mass Violence Center, one of our great partners was the Dart Center on Journalism and Trauma, and they are the go-to resource for responsible reporting, specifically on issues related to crime and victimization. So I want to share that with you. And most important, I want to leave time for a discussion where we can talk about your experiences, questions you may have, and any recommendations you have that could improve how the news media treat crime and it's particularly mass violence victims. So that's where I want to go tonight, and I'm hoping you all agree to come along for the ride, because I'm going to start going just right about now, and we'll go to the next slide, please. So, as I said earlier in my introduction, this is actually next week is my 41-year anniversary as a victim advocate. Yay! But I want to say 4 things up front, and I want you to maybe write these down because I'd like to discuss these specifically at some point in tonight to see if you agree with me if you have any of your perspective to add to what I'm saying, just to throw out kind of my theories from 4 decades of experience. I truly believe that most, and if not most, many news media professionals are responsible and they want to be sensitive to mass violence victims and survivors. I believe that in my heart. I also know that there's a few bad apples out there that spoil the whole crop. They create chaos. They're not trauma informed. They can actually be devastating to victims in interviews that are not sensitive. But I think that is not the standard. I think that is the exception to most media. Um, I really want to hear from you. I think when you say the news media, it's a concept that's foreign to most victims and survivors. Most of us will read a newspaper, we'll go online, we'll watch, ABC News at night, CNN, Fox News, whatever. But when you're a victim and you come face to face with the news media, it is a whole different ballgame. And it is what I like to say, just it's a concept that is so out of the realm of reality for so many survivors. And that's why we've written so much for victims about how to make that process, for those who choose to deal with the media, how to make it as simple and non-traumatic as possible. The third one, I hope you all agree with, interactions between journalists and mass violence victims and survivors. It is stressful for both parties. And I say that because we know the re-traumatization that can happen to survivors. But I can't tell you how many journalists I've talked to over the years who have said the most difficult challenge in their jobs is when they have to talk to a crime survivor. And I've talked to a lot of journalists who have covered mass violence incidents. You can do that times 10 because they are dealing with just a very complex situation. There's a lot of chaos going on, and they're trying to get the story from the people who are most directly impacted. And, again, that's when we hear of things that can sometimes go off the rails if they're not done properly. So I think we need to recognize stress on both sides. And the last thing is information is power for survivors. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. When I talk about considerations and consequences, these are things that, as an advocate for victims, and as said earlier, I've done a lot of high profile cases. We want victims to understand as they're making a decision whether or not they want to deal with the news media. The first thing relates to personal safety, and that is simply an environment for media interviews that is private and that is safe and where they feel comfortable. And we're going to talk tonight about having support people with them is one of my best tips for survivors. And the other thing is, I talk a lot about the perils of social media. And I don't have to explain to anyone on this meeting tonight about the conspiracy theorists who are out there and people who have significant mental health challenges who take the opportunity. Anytime you put yourself out in the media, people now have the opportunity to comment online. And you all have read, I think, some of those comments that are so hurtful, so off base, and things that really make some survivors feel unsafe, including death threats. And so personal safety is really, really important. Privacy and confidentiality, survivors need to understand that once you're identified by name by the media, often accompanied by photographs, by broadcast images, it becomes part of the public record. And this is an important choice that once made, it can't be changed. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. So that's a really important part of the decision-making process. The third point is, it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it. Media interviews can be traumatic and they can be very stressful. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but mainly it's because you are going to be talking about what you might have seen or heard or experienced during the mass violence incident and since. And talking about these things, again, can be a really difficult trauma cue for survivors. And we train the media about that. We train them that it's okay to stop an interview if someone's expressing stress. And so just recognizing that when I said information is power, the more you know about the media, the more support you have in doing media interviews, the less likely you're going to have that type of high trauma and stress. I think the consequence that is just the reason we do this work is that When survivors talk to the media, it increases awareness about the impact of mass violence incidents. And I see your names in the chat, and I recognize folks who I've seen on the media. And I know a lot of you have been very generous with sharing your lived experiences so that others might learn from it. And the one of the best things about this work and about making a decision on behalf of survivors to speak to the media is that people just get it. They get that it's not something you get over quickly. They really understand better the long-term consequences of mass violence. And the last thing I want to talk about, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time because we have a whole court planning guide, but you have to really consider if there's going to be a criminal case. And right now, our center, I think we are involved in maybe 4 or 5 criminal cases, some of them dual jurisdictions, both federal and state level cases at the same time or pretty close to the same time. Um, there's a whole different set of rules when a victim is a witness in a criminal case. And so we have a court planning guide, and I would encourage you all, if you haven't seen it, to go take a peek because we wrote a section specifically on the media. But we just encourage victims, if there is an active criminal case, that they make a decision to not speak to the media. The judge can issue a gag rule, but our advice is that you do not want to have a negative impact on the outcome of the case. And I know that's really difficult for victims who do want to speak out, but it's something that they just need to understand. The consequence of speaking out could be detrimental. So those are just some upfront considerations and consequences. And we'll go to the next slide and talk about our guidelines. And again, this is a tip sheet, so I'm not going to go deep dive into this because we have lots of tip sheets that you all can look at. And then I would, Team Hart, after we go through the guidelines, maybe open it up for questions and discussion if that's okay. The first thing for survivors is to learn all you can about the media and about the interview process, and the fact that victims don't know you have a lot more control over the interview process than you realize. And we have trained thousands of victim advocates about how to advocate for victims in the news media, but you don't have to be a trained victim advocate. You can just be a person who cares about the survivor, who is there to support them, because the more survivors understand the interview process, the better the interview will be. And we actually have specific tip sheets that talk about really thinking in advance about what you want to say and then saying it, because you're going to be asked questions that you think this isn't really relevant to what I want to talk about. We tell survivors, talk about what you want to talk about. That is the most important thing for you, and I really do think it is the same for public awareness. We spend a lot of time teaching survivors about how the media operates, because usually they're talking to a reporter. There may be a camera person or a broadcast crew with them, but there's also editors, managing editors, photographers, headline writers, who all are part of print stories. And then when you look at television and online interviews, you got the editors, the news directors, the producers, all of those folks who contribute to broadcast stories. And so there's a whole hierarchy. In one of our tip sheets, we actually have a visual of the hierarchy for both print and broadcast media, so that victims understand it's not just the reporter you're dealing with, it's just a whole bunch of people that will have a say in the final story that gets published or broadcast. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on fact checkers, but I will say I love them. They are really, really important to make sure that what is reported is accurate. This is helpful not only to victims, but often you're going to have people speaking on behalf of an alleged or convicted perpetrator. You're going to have, I don't know the word for it, but I'm just going to say yahoos out there who might have been near the mass violence incident, might not have been. They just think that it's important that they get their day in the sun to talk to the news media. And so you just want to make sure that what is put out there, especially on behalf of victims, is very accurate, and to make sure that what the victims is saying is not incorrectly interpreted. And we train journalists to always, check back with the victims, like, what I heard you say is this. And it's just really, really important to make sure that we do this for the accuracy of interviews. And we will go to the next slide, please. Um, I think it's really, really important with survivors to plan ahead for media interviews. And the second point cannot be understated. A support person, whether it's a trained advocate like myself, like many of you, or just someone who loves you, a family member, a minister, or a rabbi, a imam, a friend, someone to accompany to you to media interviews is really, really important so that you are as comfortable as you possibly can be. Um, we tell victims to really think in advance. I always say three things. I learned, I don't know, 20 years ago from the father of the victim impact statement, Jim Rowland from Fresno, California. He told me that people remember three things, and my whole life has been three things. And so, going into media interviews, focus on what are the three things that you want to get across, and make sure out of all the questions that are asked that those three things are covered. So plan ahead is really, really important. The fourth point here should go without saying. And I'll talk a little bit later about what DART says about this, but you should be expected to be treated with respect by the news media. And this, it should go without saying, but I think also in the chaos of the immediate mass violence incident, when there are swarms of survivors, there are swarms of responders, and swarms of media people. Sometimes the respect part goes by the wayside, but it's something that when victims make a conscious choice to deal with the news media, that they do so knowing that it's going to be a respectful process. Um, we this last point is something that I can't emphasize enough is that you don't have to talk to the news media. And equally important, you can say no to a request for interview, even if you've previously spoken to other folks. I've had media folks say to me, "Well, you spoke to ABC, so now you have to speak to CBS." My response is, I don't have to do anything I don't want to do. And so victims need to know that, especially if it's a very public event or at the time the MVI is occurring or shortly thereafter, just because someone sticks a microphone in your face, you don't have to talk. It is not something you have to do. And the importance of victim autonomy and choice in deciding whether or not to deal with the media is really, really important. And we will go to the next slide. So, this is where it comes in handy to have a support person or an advocate. We tell survivors part of your power and control is you select the date, time, and location for the media interview. You select the platform or the process for the media interview. If they want you to come into a studio, for example, and you're more comfortable doing an interview in your living room, that can be arranged. You don't have to do what the media say because that takes away your power and control. And knowing that you have that autonomy is really, really important. We have also trained a lot of victim advocates to learn how to be spokespersons for victims. There are some victims who, no matter what, they don't want to deal with the media. It is too traumatic. It is too threatening to them. It may make them feel unsafe. They don't want to be out there identified in the public, but they want to share their lived experiences. And so we train people on how to be a good representative or spokesperson for that survivor. And, there have been a lot of media folks who said, "Well, I don't want to talk to a spokesperson." And our response is, then you will talk to nobody. And they always circle back and say, "We would love to talk to the spokesperson or advocate for the survivor." So just remember that, again, that's part of the power that the victim has. Um, Victims can also release a written or an oral statement. They can do a video, whether they're on screen or not, doesn't matter. That's their choice, instead of an interview. And for a lot of victims who don't want to go through the interview process, but do want their voice to be heard, this is really, really important. The other thing about written and oral or videotape statements is that it's accurate. There's no way you're going to get misquoted. There is no way that there's going to be erroneous information put out there because you have the record of it. Um, the last one here is we really encourage victims to avoid a stressful atmosphere by speaking to one reporter at a time. The only time this doesn't come into play is when a victim chooses to speak, for example, at a press conference or at a memorial event for an annual observance, for example, where they choose to speak to a larger group of media. But again, with planning and preparation, we can help survivors do that in a way that is as least stressful as possible. But for a lot of victims, the one on one connection with the reporter is much less stressful than the press conference atmosphere that sometimes it can be. I just can be totally, totally overwhelming to survivors. And we will go to the next slide, please. Um, Part of my role as a victim advocate is recommending ground rules or boundaries for all media interviews. There are some survivors who don't want to talk about the perpetrator. There are some survivors who all they want to talk about is the perpetrator. You can establish ground rules in advance that say what you're comfortable speaking about and addressing and things that would make you uncomfortable. And again, the role of the victim advocate is to be able to, I always have like a little cue with survivors if I'm their advocate where they can let me know that, we're not going there. That's a boundary that they're going beyond. And so ground rules, I think, become really, really important. Any question that makes you uncomfortable, in working with survivors in advance, it's hard for a person to say, that question that you asked is making me very uncomfortable, but it's okay to say that. And I want reporters to know if they're asking something in an insensitive way, that they just made a survivor uncomfortable, and that is not cool. And so either an advocate or the survivor themselves can say, I'm not going to answer that. I'm not going to answer that question. Um, the other thing is that we can end an interview at any time. Usually an advanced part of the ground rules is that we're going to talk for 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Usually you set a little time frame on that. But if there's a time when a victim is getting very, very stressed out, I have no problem saying, we're going to stop this interview and we're going to get back to you at a later time. I don't want the interview process to be traumatic for a survivor, and it's my role as their advocate to make sure that they're not. Um, I always suggest audio taping and videotaping interviews. And over the years, when journalists, and I've been doing this for 40 years, so this is back before the internet, when they would say, do you mind if I audio tape this interview? I would always pull out my little, I don't know if y'all remember those little recorders we used to have. They were like, I don't know, little cassette recorders. And I would always say, no, I don't, but I hope you don't mind that I'm recording it as well. To make sure that they understand I'm documenting for the accuracy of the whole conversation. And the other thing is, I think it's helpful for a survivor to know in advance what the story is going to be about. I think it's really important if the journalist wants to talk about the broader issue of mass violence, they need to know that. If they want to hear what the victim thinks about the alleged perpetrator and the victim doesn't want to address that, need to know in advance. And so it's not asking the reporter to lay out, my job as a journalist is to ask the questions. It's just saying, give us a framework so that my victim, whether I'm the person who I'm advocating for, will know a little bit and be a little bit about the story and be more comfortable in having that conversation with you. And thank you. I just saw that chat. Yay, you go. And we'll go to the next slide, please. And then after this slide, well, this is when I'm going to open it up. You can request a specific reporter. And I will say, I'm going to speak about the Resiliency and Justice Center. Y'all do such a great job on the media. And you have reporters who come to you on a regular basis. And so good reporters. And I'm going to guess that bad reporters. Hopefully a lot more good reporters than bad reporters. But it's okay to request a specific reporter. And I know when I've worked on high profile cases with survivors, they literally, I've had people say that they wanted to talk to Katie Couric because they watched the Today Show, 30 years ago, and we got them an interview with Katie Couric. They want to talk to the crime reporter that they see the byline in their local newspaper. They don't know that person, but they know the byline. You can request a specific reporter, and as advocates or support people, one of my jobs is to make sure that the reporter is someone who is trauma informed and sensitive. And my other favorite thing is to refuse an interview with a reporter, even if you've granted interviews to other reporters. That hasn't happened to me very often. It has happened when someone has been, can I say an asshole? I mean, someone has been really, really inconsiderate of victims and has said things that have been so traumatic to the victim and traumatic to me as their advocate. And I just don't want to expose a survivor or myself to that kind of person. And so it's okay to say no. And for me, it's important to say, this we're not going to be speaking to you because the last interview you did, fill in the blank. Use it as an educational opportunity for these people so that they can improve their sensitivity to victims. My golden rule, and I have so many stories about why this is a golden rule. Children and adolescents should never, ever be interviewed. And that is a hard, fast. And if someone wants to chit chat and argue with me after this, I would love to have that conversation because children cannot make an informed decision by themselves. Neither can adolescents. And when there's a mass violence incident at a school, which lately has been frequently, interviewing the impacted children becomes something that journalists want to do. And I don't know if you all remember, because some of you look very young, but when the massacre occurred at Columbine High School, um, and there was the broadcast journalists were there kind of across the field. The children were running out of the high school and the journalists were running after them with microphones. And that's not the worst part. The worst part is after that happened and good victim advocates commented on how offensive that was, a journalist actually said that she felt it was like being a psychologist to the students, that she felt it was helping them process what had happened to them. Now, they are running from an active shooting that's still going on, and she's thinking she's giving therapy. So that's just, it's one example among countless that I have. But please, and let's discuss this. Kids, adolescents, never, ever, ever. And then if there's inaccurate information reported, every broadcast medium, every print medium, it's a little bit harder on the internet, but not impossible. You can demand a correction. And that's, for me, sometimes that is a really long process, but getting a correction that's printed or said out loud on the evening news is really important if something inaccurate was said. And it really validates to the victim that what you said was what you meant to say and what was reported was wrong. I don't have to do that very often. Going back to my earlier comment that I do think most journalists try to get it right and are sensitive. But when it happens, it's like one of the proudest things I do as a media advocate for victims is getting that correction. And the last one here, and then I'll jump back to the giving your side, is there's processes for filing complaints against journalists. And I have to say, in my 40 plus years, I think I've filed complaints against maybe 2 or 3 journalists for really egregious actions. But it's not something that happens often, but it's something that as an advocate for victims, if we need to do it, we do it on their behalf. And I think that's really important. And then the second to the last point here is, victims really need to completely give their side of the story. And it is their lived experience. It is their perception and their perspective of what happened. And that's what I think the journalist wants to hear. It's certainly what the public needs to hear. And I think that, again, is the power of the personal story of mass violence survivors. I can't tell you. It's why I'm so happy to be with you here tonight. It's why I'm so happy to be aligned with Heart, is that the power of your experiences is so helpful to, I'm not going to exaggerate, the entire world to hear, to learn, and to, as much as possible, try to understand how you were impacted and how entire communities are impacted by mass violence incidents. And so I have a few more slides, but can we open it up for, I don't know, questions, discussions. I know I just heaved a bunch of information at you. Again, this is all in the 7 tip sheets. I have a slide that tells you how to access those. Any questions or thoughts from our survivors, our providers, our folks tonight?
So, and I do actually have a thought as you were talking about this, and I know you were talking about print media and that the news media, but there's also podcasts.
Yeah.
So these guidelines would apply for those as well. I've been a guest on a few podcasts. I actually was just approached to do another one, but this is something it's really important to know, what they're planning to talk about,
Yeah.
because we don't want it to go in a direction that we're not comfortable with.
Yeah.
We
I
need to make sure we're safe.
I'm going to say 2 things. One is that the National Center for Victims of Crime just within the last 6 months released a guide for victims and podcasts. And if y'all haven't read it, I would really encourage, and I'm happy to follow up, Jill, with your team afterwards, because it really explains the importance of preparing victims and survivors for that experience. And I will also say that for the last couple of years, I did hosted a podcast of survivors for the Office for Victims of Crime in the Justice Department. And I will tell you, I usually have a discussion guide. I love doing podcasts as a moderator. I usually have a discussion guide, and I just sort of laid the questions out there. With victims and survivors, they get the questions in advance. They get to say, don't ask this that way, or don't ask this at all, or could you focus on this is what I want to say. And I have to tell you, I've never had a draft discussion guide that remained the same when I reviewed it with the survivor, because they bring themselves to the interviews. And I have to tell you, it just makes the podcast so much better. And the thing about podcasts is that, they can be 30 minutes, they can be 90 minutes. That is a long time. And that can be 90 minutes. Just talking for 90 minutes is stressful, but talking about a painful, traumatic experience for 90 minutes, holy moly. So again, giving victims as much power and control. And I would love Renee Williams at the NCVC would be a great guest for you to talk specifically about podcasts, because I'm guessing some of you have had that experience.
That'd be great.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I had an interview once at one of the remembrances of our shooting, and we were all hugging and crying. And this news lady comes in and says, "Hey, can we do an interview with you?" And the other girl was like, "Yeah." And she's like, "No, we want the girl that's crying." And I'm like, "Yeah, no, this isn't a good time." And then another lady come forward and said, "Why don't you come back after after we're done reading the names?" Because we were just getting ready to get started reading the names. And I thought, how rude or disrespectful to say, "Oh no, we want the one that's crying." Like, really?
That's pretty blunt, and you handled that well.
Well, I didn't have to handle it. Everybody else came and said, "Nope, get out, bye."
Yeah.
And that was great. But one thing that you had touched on is that, and of course, I got to thank Jill Winter, my best friend ever, who just said, "You need to go to on-site, man. Like, it's going to change your life." And being at on-site around other people that have been through what you've been through, it makes such a huge difference. Just listening and talking, and especially our therapists had even been through a traumatic event to where they knew exactly how you felt. And that's the relationships that I made at on-site, is because you don't have to explain why you're crying or why you don't want to, share that day, or, you know what I mean? Because everybody gets it, I think bonds you, because then you know that that person knows what you're feeling. They know you're going to have a bad day. They know that you're going to be there to support them another day, And I think that's the main reason why I have joined these Zooms and have been part of, the healing process this way, because you guys get it, and you know me and my pain, and And some days I'm fine and some days I'm not. And that's just how it is.
And yeah, Tara, I think you brought up a really good point that talking about it can be healing, and that includes talking about it with reporters and getting our story out there. It helps to educate people who don't understand what we've been through, because as I think most of us know, most of our families and friends don't understand what we're feeling. Like you were saying, it's those of us who have been through a similar situation that do understand, but educating people who don't understand can be very beneficial. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
I find it's a lot easier to do with like newspaper interviews to where they're writing your words down compared to like filming you. Because I remember it took me to a Fox 5 interview here in Vegas, and I went and I was ready to be on TV, and then they had the cameras there, and I was like, yeah, I'm not going to do this. Like, I couldn't do it
And that's
because my
okay.
face was like sad, and I was like, I don't want to be on TV like this. So I just said, can I just write some stuff down? And so they wrote like what I would say, but didn't have me on camera. And even at Country Thunder, when I met with the reporter there, with our survivor group at Country Thunder, and she did a newspaper interview, she nailed it. Like she wrote out such a great piece. And so I really like the newspapers better than the cameras. Yeah.
Well, part of it is just being prepared in advance. And I don't know if you had someone helping you with that process, but like we've said earlier tonight, explaining what's going to happen. I mean, it's not that different between a paper interview and a broadcast interview, except you're on TV. And that is, for a lot of people, Tara, I have to say, it's just a whole different ball game. But I love that you complimented journalists, because and I should have had that as one of my points, is whenever someone writes a good story, I always write them an email or a personal thank you note, or write it to their boss, even better, saying, as you said, they nailed it, that it was sensitive, and it was good coverage. And I think that's important too. So thank you, Tara, so much for sharing your experience.
Christina, you had something you wanted to share, and then there's a comment in the chat I want to acknowledge.
Yeah, I ended up being, I was at Highland Park, and there was a picture in the paper when we went to go, before I left town. I'm not from there. And, I got called by someone from the and they're like, hey, you're on national, like they were using our picture. And they didn't ask to use it, but it just felt, like you said, it's violating, but we dealt with it. And a few months later, though, it was used again because it becomes like a Getty image.
Oh.
And it was used in an article saying something about like gun, whatever. I'm sorry about that, but it was like money. Our picture was used. It wasn't our faces, but it upset me because it was like, wait, that's not what we believe, and I don't remember if it was like against registries or something. And a friend of mine, I called her and I was just very upset, and I didn't expect to be upset about it. And she wrote the editor, or the person who did the byline, and said, look, you're just throwing this picture up here, but these are real people and this is not what they believe. And you're throwing their name, or, whatever with it. And when we had gone, because we were leaving town and I wanted to just go by the scene, there were reporters everywhere, and they were like, oh, do you want to talk to Lester Holt or all these other people? And I was like, I don't know that I could say anything at that moment, and then somebody had talked about other people who weren't like I was literally at the scene at ground zero. Other people were ones getting on TV, and they keep posting, and I don't know. I talked about to another survivor who was behind me, and she said, there's this anger I have, and I don't know how to explain it, but it's like, yeah, you're out there and you're saying all this and it's great, but you really don't know what it was like to be there. And I feel bad for having that anger. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But it's like, you didn't hear, you weren't there when it happened. You didn't hear and smell and see, the things that we did, and like that's tough for me. And I see them and I'm just like, oh, I'm trying to be, I don't call them out or anything, but it's still tough. And then ours just got sentenced um in in March, I think, finally. And I watched, and I had different reactions from people. When you talk about being alone, it's like I have done this by myself. I think I'm 700 or 800 miles away. I have nobody in my community because I went to this community and was impacted, which, I know like Route 91, some of those folks, you weren't from there. And I don't feel that I have, like, this is my only support system.
Mm.
Um, and I got to watch it, but it was so hard. And I mean, hearing those statements was tough. And it showed up in my local newspaper, which was weird. And I have this thing like, I'm glad I'm kind of anonymous, but I also wish I could have made a statement now, but it feels like, oh, hey, by the way, I want to tag on this and say I was a victim. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
It-
but I knew that had I told people at the time, because my family was in broadcast, if I had told them at the time, I would have been inundated, and I couldn't handle that at the time. And then now it feels like, I want to say something about it, but I don't know. I don't know if that makes any sense. That's just my thoughts.
Christina, it makes sense. And I want to give two responses, if I may. And thank you. Thank you for sharing. We have worked with our centers work closely with the Highland Park community, and I really do appreciate hearing your experience. The first thing is the Getty image. I would have no problem advocating on your behalf of the image and saying that it's being used inappropriately. I would love to do that for you. So my email is going to be at the end of this slide presentation. So just you think about that, and we can get in touch. The other thing I want to say is that we've been working with Highland Park on the defendant pled guilty with a lot of strange circumstances that you are aware of.
Yeah.
And the sentencing hearing is now, and it would be okay.
No, it's already completed.
It's completed.
It was completed. It was completed. Yeah. And I was able to watch it, and it was just, it was hard. I mean, and the thing is, like, my marriage broke up over this. I mean, I think a lot of people explain, have that too. And I was watching it, and he happened to come over, and he was like, I don't know why I'm not going to talk to you if you're watching that crap, was what he said.
Ugh.
And, and but it was something I needed. And I had other people like, why are you watching this? You just need to not. And, um, I'm a counselor too. And I went to my own, trauma counseling for myself. And, it's, I appreciate what you guys do because, like I said, I've, even from people who were at the event, there's different attitudes, and some people are like us, but other people, are like, oh, shit happens. And I'm like, this is not shit happening. I mean, as we're walking away from this, family members are like, you're so obsessed with this. I don't know why you're still talking about, I don't know why you're still involved. And I'm like, because it changed my life, and I've talked to I've gotten, the honor of speaking to some other survivors from other things too. And, there's this weird, you can't talk about it with everybody, oh, I did get in the paper. I forgot that I went back for the 1 year memorial, and the lady was saying, I think it was Tara, that I hugged I found one of the victims' families, and I just wanted to go up and hug them and talk to them. And the reporters were told to be very respectful in approaching anyone. And a reporter did come up to me and ask me if she could talk to me. So I ended up in the paper, and I'm on the front page the next day, a year later, again, which I wasn't really expecting, not my face, but, there's a lot of stuff that's just, I never thought about as a consumer of news media,
You don't.
whether in print or on,
You don't.
online, and most of it's online. And, those were things that just, I wasn't even prepared for as a survivor to, and I'm like, have you ever been in print? I'm like, well, yeah, not exactly what I thought it would be, but yeah, for this. And I kind of wanted to go back and follow up with them because they were following up with other victims and survivors and family members. But and it's just like I feel like I don't have to correct a narrative, but I kind of want to say like this is 3 years later because July will be our 3 years, and
Yeah.
that's just like it's making me emotional, and I'm kind of weirded out, but I'm real, so there we go.
Christina, you're in a very safe
Yeah, I
space.
thank y'all for that. Thank you.
I want to thank you for sharing. And you said something that you're far away from Highland Park, but your local media did a story. You can get that reporter's byline and give them a call or an email and say, I saw that story. And I don't know if you're aware that I am a survivor of Highland Park. And if you're interested in a story about the impact of mass violence victimization 3 years later in a community that's how many, 700 miles? How far away are you?
I'm not sure. I mean,
Far away.
I'm in Louisiana, and
There you go.
yeah, and
That's a story, and I would encourage you on one of my upcoming slides. We do have good resources that would help you, feel really strong about doing a good interview. But to get a story in Louisiana about a survivor from Illinois, I'm feeling the power of that in my heart right now.
it was in a small town paper, which shocked me. I'm sitting there with a friend of mine at chemo reading, and I'm like, it's on the second page. Like,
Yeah.
really? And I'm in Lafayette, but we had our own incident it was a movie theater.
I remember, gosh.
And, so, and I'm reading, and it's just kind of weird. And then, like I said, I don't know, like the people who are called tertiary, who are kind of in the area, and they go on most of the victims are not able in the first days or two to talk about it to the media. There's too much emotion, but I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought now. Yes, I feel like we're going, hey, I want to get on TV because of this, but it's or on online, but I still feel like it's important. I mean, I still talk to my counselor groups that I'm involved in as a counselor, and they're like, when you get to a point, talk about what is it like being a counselor, also being a part of trauma, because that's a whole different bird altogether.
Yes, indeed.
I shouldn't have to go through all this because I'm a counselor, damn it. But anyway.
Yeah, right.
Christina, you raised another good point. That you said it's small town media. I don't know of any media for which mass violence is not a pretty big deal. Because I'm not going to give you the rundown of small towns.
Oh yeah.
Recently that have had mass violence incidents, very small rural communities that we're working with. It doesn't matter. People know now that it can strike anywhere. And that is why, my early slide, it's just so important that survivors, if they are able to speak out. So that's something that it's an option and an opportunity for you if you choose to take it. So thank you, Christina, for sharing. And I love Lafayette. I went fishing there once.
We have good food. Come eat.
The best in the world, Christina. Southern cooking. Lum lum.
That's awesome.
There is no such thing as off the record in our guidebooks that we've written. And again, I have links to some of our tip sheets at the end of my presentation. We give really practical tips like that. Nothing is off the record. And I'm so sorry you had that experience. And, talk about sensationalizing. A couple survivors tonight have talked about, when you're crying, they want the photo. That's what they want. And when you think about, and I'm not making this up, the Pulitzer Prize winning photos over the past 30 years, a good many of them have been of traumatized victims. And I remember the Oklahoma City bombing, certainly 9/11. And so showing the human suffering becomes part of capturing that story with no consideration to, again, Highland Park using a photo that's now a Getty image that's being misused. Once it's out there, it's out there. So sorry, I'm babbling, but I'm trying to follow the stream of comments tonight, which I'm finding very, very helpful. Thank you all so much.
Yeah.
And I've had that too, where I've had two different ones. I went to right after Borderline. I went to Thousand Oaks, and my picture with a couple of other routers was in the paper, and we were out crying. And then at our, I think it was our 4 year remembrance, it was a picture they got of us crying. I'm like, of all pictures they could have chosen,
Mm.
why the one where we look the absolute worst? And I know it's the raw, the raw emotion,
Yeah.
but it's like, man.
Yeah.
So I get that. And Amy, I know a couple of families of our 58 who have had their words turned around, and they refuse to talk to reporters anymore as well, just because of that. So it's unfortunate, um, because there's so much to say, but when they don't share what we've said, it makes it really hard to trust.
But Jill, there's other ways to say it. You mentioned podcasts earlier. There are other ways to get the message out. Hearing your lived experiences tonight, that it's okay to say no. And Amy made a good point. You may not be ready to speak right at the scene of the crime or shortly thereafter. A couple of years down the road, you may be in a good position to speak. And then you may go back to, I don't want to speak again. All of those feelings are just fine. You have the power, you have the autonomy. And that's kind of the most important message of tonight's discussion.
Yeah, and we've got a comment in the chat that after Route 91 um, landed and her parents are picking her up from the airport, her reporters followed her out to her parents' vehicle. So they are just, I don't know. That's a bad news for me in the first place. And then,
Bad
um,
reporter.
and then asking her dad, "Are you glad she's home and safe?" And her dad gave a poised answer, but what he wanted to say was probably,
Yeah.
not. She said it wouldn't have made it on live TV. So, they were able to process that as a family and say, okay, well, he was just doing his job, but it felt really bad to them. And of course, she had just gotten home. It had never even occurred to them not to answer a question, because she's still in that state of shock. So
That happened when I landed in San Diego after Route 2. There were reporters everywhere, and they were ruthless. And I actually looked at my now ex, and I'm like, so help me, if they come over to me, I'm liable just to punch them, because I didn't know what else to do. But they were so ruthless and rude to people. It was awful.
And what you're describing too is when there's a competition, you got 4 or 5 or 6 or 12 or more media, they're all there to get the story, and that's when the sensitivity kind of falls by the wayside. And I'm sorry to hear your experiences, but these are really good to be able to share when we talk to journalists, which I still do on occasion, to let them know that these are lived experiences that point to the need for you to be a little bit more trauma informed. So
absolutely.
Thank you for advocating for us.
I'm happy.
Jackie, you had your hand up. Was there something you wanted to share?
Yeah, just real quick. My experience with the media goes back to a high profile case I got assigned to over 20 years ago. And that was my first experience with finding out that they really make up stories and chase you through parking lots and all kinds of fun stuff. I will say though, and it's a very odd thing as a trauma therapist, because the work we do is confidential. So there was never any conversation, of course, about what we were doing. Now, at least our role, and I will say the Resiliency Center, the Resiliency and Justice Center, and Tennille, our director in particular, has worked very hard to set the boundaries and be very protective. And we get to focus on the services and supports and how this is still impacting folks. Sometimes when maybe we want to educate people, and so we can use it in that good, but then also I know the bad side. So I always stick with this is what I'm going to talk about: our services, our supports, what's normal, and how we can help folks. And that's a good thing. But us therapists and outside folks can have really bad experiences too.
So,
Thank you.
and I just want to say, and then I do have a couple more slides with resources, is that kind of a unifying message. And I heard it from a couple of you tonight, and I'm really validating what you said, is that you don't get over it. That if I could make that a bumper sticker for mass violence survivors and impacted communities, you don't get over it. And there are so many people who just want to sweep it under, whether it's a husband or a mayor or a bunch of hotels. It doesn't matter. We have to fight that message that it's not something you get over. And I think, again, only through the power of the personal story and hearing your experiences tonight, and I'm sorry that so many of them were bad, that's an opportunity we have. And, I mean, kind of like almost, I feel like it's an obligation to let people know it's not something you will ever get over. And the fact that there are so many mass violence incidents, that's trauma queue, trauma queue, trauma queue, trauma queue, just validates my point. So, do you all mind if I share a couple more slides? Because I know
That'd be awesome.
okay. I just want to make sure I get my resources to you. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because you can go back and read this. We actually have a tip sheet on this. I mentioned earlier the Dark Center for Journalism and Trauma. I would encourage you all to go look. They're just amazing people, and all they focus on is the ethical considerations of journalists. And this is what they say. And I'm thinking about your stories you shared tonight. They would identify themselves, prioritize the safety of victims, check the accuracy of victims' names and the title of their work experience, especially when the victim is a murder victim, seek permission for interviews, accept a no, respect a request not to be identified by name, and then confirm the accuracies of rumors or evolving information before publishing or broadcasting. So I want you all to know, with the sad stories we've heard of irresponsible journalists tonight, you have the Dark Center that's just putting out great information and resources. And they have specific information related to victim trauma, but also to homicide victims. So I would encourage you to visit their website. And then we'll go to the next slide. So I promise some treats. These are our tip sheets. And as part of our work, I should have mentioned, for the Office of Victims of Crime at the Justice Department, which supports our National Mass Violence Center, we are actually going to be broadening the tip sheets and diving a little bit deeper into the issues related to victims in the media. So I appreciate your input tonight, because it makes me realize we have more work to do on the things that we've already written. Your experiences, I think, will make me rethink how we're putting the information out for survivors. And so please visit the website. And I think that might be all of my slides, except for I have a slide with my email. I want to make sure I share. There you go. That is me. I am at the Medical University of South Carolina, the National Mass Violence Center. And I would encourage you to email me, to reach out to me if you want to share your experiences without being identified or being identified. It's really helpful to us, because I've been doing this over 40 years, and there's not a day that goes by that I don't learn something new. And today it's been like, woof, learning so much new and so much that is helpful, not just to me as a victim advocate, but also on wisdom I can impart to journalists who, they never think they're going to be covering a mass violence incident until they are. And if you remember when I said earlier on, it is very traumatic for journalists, and part of my work is to educate them so it's least traumatic as possible to them, which means they will be more sensitive to victims. So those are my slides. I wanted to see any other. This is such a good and rich discussion that I appreciate so much.
And by all means, please feel free to reach out to Anne after this. Let's go ahead and go on with our little wrap up slides. If you have anything at the end, we can stay on. But I know it's getting late for some people. I know that during the discussion, the On-Site Foundation was mentioned. It's their Triumph Over Tragedy program. So we want to let everybody know that the dates are August 7th through the 13th of this year. It's going to be at their Ramona campus. You would fly into San Diego. That would be the closest airport. The program cost is covered through donations. This is for anybody who's been impacted. I'm sorry, anybody who's been physically there at the mass violence incident. Your only out of pocket is a $200 registration fee and transportation to the San Diego airport. They will have a shuttle pick you up. I went to their very first one in March of 20. There are several people on this program, some people I know who have been since. It's an amazing program. It's a life-changing program. You must be at least 1 year post-incident. And this is the link to fill out the initial application. The initial application is a very brief application just for more contact information. And they will have a much more involved application for you to fill out after that. It's definitely something that I would encourage people to go to. It makes a huge difference in just adding the tools to our tool belt that can help us continue to process what we've been through. Okay, so we just wanted to remind you guys that all of the integrative services offered through the Resiliency and Justice Center are available to anyone impacted by any mass violence incident. And by anyone impacted, we do mean family, friends, loved ones, because they truly were impacted by what we've experienced as well. So all the programs are free with the exception of the equine therapy demonstration. They are all virtual. The equine therapy demonstration is in Las Vegas. If you happen to be in Vegas or you live there, you're visiting, and they're doing the equine therapy demonstration, please feel free to go ahead and go. All of these, the dates and the information is on the resiliencyandjustice.org/calendar. You can sign up for any of those there. So this is just the brief calendar of the things that are going on this month. Anything that is not event specific, so route or UNLV, is open to anyone impacted. We have the trauma recovery yoga. There's the meditative art therapy. I know we've brought that up, and the Resiliency Center has added a second program. So it is going to be the second and fourth Tuesday of the month. So we have first Tuesdays and then meditative art on the second Tuesday, and then our third Tuesday support group, and then the fourth Tuesday meditative. So you could just plan on spending your Tuesdays with us. But there's a lot of really good programs available. And so we'd really encourage you guys, because they are free, they are virtual, to attend when your schedule allows. So additional support resources, if you would like to be paired with a Heart peer mentor, you go to resiliencyandjustice.org/heart. The Disaster Distress Helpline was created for people impacted by natural and man-made disasters. They have 24/7 crisis support. And this can even be I can't sleep, I'm having thoughts of my incident, I need to get these off my mind. It can be 3 o'clock in the morning, it doesn't matter. They have crisis counselors who are there to walk us through that. As Anne mentioned, the National Mass Violence Center has a wealth of resources, tons of tip sheets and other great information. Their virtual resiliency center is amazing as well. The Transcend NMBC app, which Amy, who spoke earlier, was a part of, I know. That's actually specifically for people who've been impacted by mass violence. So I would really encourage you guys to download that app if you haven't already. Make sure when you're doing it, it's the Transcend NMBC app, because there are a couple of other Transcend apps available. I think most of us know about the 988 number, but that's super important to just remind everybody of, to have in case us or somebody we know needs it. We do have our First Tuesdays with Heart Facebook page. All of the recordings from our prior First Tuesdays with Heart are available on there, as well as the Resiliency Center's YouTube page. We've had a lot of amazing presenters. We have a lot of more great programs coming up, and actually Amy is going to be one of our presenters later on this year too, so that's exciting. And a fun group for people impacted by mass violence. If you enjoy cooking, if you want to get into cooking, we do know that cooking is grounding. So we have a Cooking for Post-Traumatic Growth Facebook page where we share recipes. A lot of fun. So next month, our First Tuesdays with Heart will be on June 3rd. We're going to talk about how nutrition helps heal with Holly Abbott, who's a functional nutrition and health coach. So that should be an interesting one. We'd encourage you guys to join us. So we wanted to thank everybody for joining us. Like I said, if you have any other questions or comments for Anne, we're happy to stay on afterwards and talk with you. But we really got what you guys. We want to thank you guys for taking your time, and this is an important subject. So we're really glad that you were able to be with us.